There's probably three words that I probably preach the most in gestation, and that's body condition score.
Welcome to Swine Canada. My name is John Patience, and I'll be the host of today's podcast. And I'm delighted to welcome as our guest in this podcast, Dr. Laura Greiner, who is on the faculty at Iowa State University. We're doing actually a series of 3 podcasts together, dealing first with the developing gilt, then with the gestating sow, which will be the topic of this podcast, and then we'll finish up in the next podcast with the lactating sow. So, Laura, welcome to Swine Canada.
Thank you, John. Glad to be on today.
Great. And Laura, you are very, very well known in the U.S., and you're becoming increasingly known in Canada. But for the benefit of our listeners who are maybe not as familiar with your background yet, perhaps you can explain a little bit about what your background is and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Happy to do so. So as John mentioned, I am Laura Greiner, and I am currently an assistant professor here at Iowa State University, and I'm also the director of the Iowa Pork Industry Center here on campus. And so I kind of came from a very traditional farming background and came to Iowa State like many good students and wanted to be pre-vet, wanted to be a veterinarian. And somehow my advisor convinced me that there was this really neat guy upstairs by the name of Dr. Tim Staley, and I should go do my master's with him. And so, as they say, the rest is history. So I got my master's and PhD under Dr. Tim Staley in swine nutrition. Spent a little bit of time actually working in human medicine on microbiomes and biofilms, and then moved over to Carthage Vet Service and worked in the Carthage system for about 13 years as the director of research on all swine production activities, and also had some time to work with nutrition projects with clients and then also within that system. So joined Iowa State about 5 years ago and have had an opportunity to teach our undergraduates about the passions and the fun of working in swine production and doing a little bit of research and then quite a bit of extension with our Iowa pork producers. So that's me in a nutshell. And again, I'm very excited and happy to be on here today to visit with you about, I think, gestating sows today.
Swine Veterinary Partners offers a full range of animal health and production services to Canadian pork producers. We approach health management through personalized solution with concern for profitability while taking into account performance and the well-being of your animals.
Right on. Great. Well, thanks for that introduction of yourself. And I know Iowa State, and certainly when I was still working, we were delighted to join you or have you join us on the faculty. So, Laura, today, as you mentioned, we're going to talk about the gestating sow next, and what would be your overall kind of picture in your mind of the quote the right way that we should be feeding the gestating sow, what we should be doing, what we should not be doing, and sometimes what we should not be doing is as important to know as what we should be doing, and some of the key take-home messages that you would have for our listening audience. So let's just start with maybe the overarching or umbrella comments you would have about successful feeding and management of the gestating sow.
Yeah, I think there's probably three words that I probably preach the most in gestation, and that's body condition score.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
When I think about feeding programs, and certainly from a practical perspective, it's body condition score. We think about it when she leaves lactation or as she's coming in as a new gilt. How do we manage her? How do we keep her in the right condition, not just at that time, but throughout gestation? Too often than not, we see people sending sows into lactation barns either overweight or sometimes, unfortunately, underconditioned. And, we really want to see about 90% of our population within our box, right? However you score them. If it's a score of 1 to 5, it's a 3. If we score them, thin, normal, and fat, we want them normal. Whatever numbers you're using or system you're using, or if you're using Dr. Nauer's calipers, for example, out of North Carolina, whatever you're using, getting them in that right spot it's absolutely critical.
Yeah.
And the reason why is if I fail, right? If I fail and she's overweight, she goes into lactation, she doesn't eat. Now I'm chasing a vicious circle because I'm adding more feed in gestation. I'm causing more feed costs for me, and trying to get her back into a normal weight before she goes back in. Plus, not to mention, I could be losing total born, because if she lost enough weight in lactation, we change conception rates, we can change total born, we can change even wean to estrus interval. And so from an economic perspective, it just makes sense. We also see sows that teeter-totter, go back and forth on body condition, thin to fat or thin to normal, and we start to see things like shoulder sores. And so we start to see welfare challenges. And so really that's kind of my overarching piece. It sounds simple, but sometimes it can be actually some of the bigger challenges within a barn, especially if you're using your eyes to make those decisions. We do see people, we call it going barn blind, right? Everybody looks right, but then a new person comes in and says, whoa, they're either this or they're that. And so, I really like having a nice, clear, objective measurement. I love Dr. Nauer's calipers from that perspective, right? There's no question, this is where you go. So along with that, then when I think about that, the overarching piece of body condition is really having a solid feeding program strategy. So, and I'm not talking about, when do we put them in body condition? Do we full feed when they're first weaned and bred and until day 30? Do we do it slowly? I'm talking about whatever you decide, have it on a piece of paper. So if she's in the red and she's thin, how much am I feeding her? Or if she's on the other side and she's overweight, how much am I supposed to feed her? And if she is normal, what is a normal allowance within the barn? That to me is a big piece of working with a nutritionist and getting that correct.
No, yeah, Laura, it's interesting you make that statement, and I like your, quantifying it and saying you want, your target would be 90% within the target zone of whether you're using the calipers or eyeballs. And when I'm talking to producers, just the calipers, they feel have solved so many problems because it makes it objective. But I remember when I was first starting in extension, and there was something that I kept noticing, but I didn't really consciously notice it till after a while. And then it seemed every barn that I went into where they had superior sow productivity, they had uniform sows in gestation. Mm-hmm. And the herds that seemed to have problems with sow productivity did not. And it just seemed so, at first I thought, John, you're just imagining things because everybody likes to see uniform sows. But then I kept track of it, and it really was true. So I appreciate that point, Laura. And it's something, it's mundane. It's something that has to get attention every day. It's something that there's nothing fancy about it, but gosh darn, it's so important.
Yeah, it is. And we talk from it, at least I talk to my grad students quite a bit from a nutrition perspective, is you can have the best diet in the world for whatever size animal. It does not matter, but we can pick on the gestating sow today. You can have the best diet, but if I fail to implement the appropriate programs within the barn, it will not work for you, right? And so body condition is a piece of this. How much do I feed this animal, is a piece of this. It gets cold in Canada. So do you change the amount you're giving her in gestation in different times of year? Or is it just along the curtains or the fans where there's a bigger draft and we see loss of condition, right? Understanding those pieces are going to be really important to getting optimal body condition score. But the other piece to that too is whatever type of feed delivery mechanism you're using, are you calibrating it regularly?
Yeah.
Right? So feed prices change. I might pull an ingredient out. I might put another in, and it might be more or less dense of a feed that we're feeding. And so if we've got a gestational feeder box up above drops, we need to make sure that if it's set at 2 kilos, it's delivering 2 kilos. If it's not, then figure out what that is. If it's a feed scoop, again, just because I have a full scoop, is it 2 kilos or is it not? We actually would spend the time every couple of months. We'd have the team go out and they would weigh feed boxes for us and then record, this is what the box said and this is what the actual weight was. And then we would hand them back their feed program, and we would not tell them feed 2 kilos on that box, on that feed program, but we tell them what to set the box to. So if 2 kilos really was 2.5 on the box, then we tell them, if you have a normal condition sow, set the box at 2.5, rather than worrying about an exact kilogram, because they couldn't see that in a box, right? So that's another piece to this is to be very mindful of the equipment that you're using. And again, kind of just step yourself through that process of all those little nuances that can impact body condition that maybe we don't see right away.
No, it's like so much of what we do in the barn. It's not only having the right equipment or the right product, it's having the right system to make sure it all comes together so that what the sow gets is what the nutritionist wants her to get.
Exactly.
And consistently.
Exactly. So that's definitely a piece when we think about a gestating sow. I think I always get questions on twice a day feeding or once a day feeding, and the slow feeding into body condition if she's thin, or aggressive feeding. And I kind of go back on those and say you need to do what's best for you in your barn. I've been in barns that feed once a day, and I walk in the afternoon and the sows are very calm and they're okay. And you walk in other barns that do it once a day and there's a lot of chatter in the afternoon. And so, right, again, some of that is just, you have to find what works, right? I've been in barns where every other year we change our minds, and I don't think there was ever a time where we said, oh, yep, that's the right way to feed her. Some of it's going to vary on genetics and some of those pieces. But when I think about some of those conversations around gestating sows, I think you have to do what's best for you and your animals. And certainly you'll know that when you're in the barns, you'll see that.
Yeah. It makes me think, your comment about you and your barn makes me think of the phrase that we don't use hardly anymore, and that's husbandry. Yes. And our ability to really do what's best for the animal and best for our operation. And very quickly, the background of that was we used to have departments of animal husbandry, and then the world of animal science became more technical, and people thought, we should have a more technical word in our name of our department. So we started calling them animal science, and the word husbandry kind of fell off the wagon, so to speak, and we didn't talk about it much anymore. But now I hear that word being used more and more. And your comment just now, Laura, is observe and see and react. Read and react, we hear a lot of. See the need, meet the need, those kinds of phrases, but they're all part of good animal husbandry. So I like the way you said that, and emphasizing how important that really is.
Yeah, thank you. When I think about other things, when we focus in on gestation, I think one of the other conversations we hear a lot is bump feeding. It's kind of getting quieter now, at least. But and I will admit, I was in the barns and I argued profusely some days when they would come out and say, we're not going to bump feed anymore, because I would say, well, I can see it, right? I can see if I don't feed, I get these thin, raily pigs versus if I bump feed, I don't. I think science there is actually, we're really starting to take a hold of it and well document it that we don't need to necessarily bump feed a sow. If she's in good condition and she's right where we want her to be, bump feeding doesn't really provide benefit to the piglet. Now, I think Chantel's work would suggest there might still be some opportunity for milk yield. And so we kind of need to keep our fingers on what she's showing. But when we think about birth weight alone, bump feeding a sow is not, if she's in good condition, is not advantageous. On the gilts, though, on the other hand, we still do see data that supports that if we increase a gilt towards those last 20 days of gestation, we can pick up some differences in birth weight. They may not be enough financially to support doing it, but we do see it in a growing female, but a mature female of good condition, we're not picking that up from a birth weight perspective. But like I said, I think Chantel's work might be changing that a little bit when we think about milk yield. So this conversation's not going away, is what I'm trying to tell you, John.
Well, not if Chantel has anything to say about
That's
it.
Right. Yeah. That's right. She'll keep us on our toes.
So of course it makes sense that bump feeding works in gilts but doesn't work in mature sows. That's not difficult to understand biologically. If somebody is asking you about bump feeding of gilts, what would your recommendation be? How much of a bump would you be providing, Laura?
Yeah, the data that we did years ago, we were still seeing a response to bump feeding even if we fed 2 kilos more a day, which is significant, right? So most of us would maybe only feed about 1 kilo more a day. And I think you can still pick up a significant difference at 1 kilo. And so, again, economics are going to play into it. And we know that birth weight plays into pre-wean mortality. And we know birth weight plays into weaning weights. And certainly it plays into market weight. So I can't give you an exact number, John, right? Because, again, I think it's going to vary based on the farm and what you're experiencing downstream. So if you are birthing out pigs that are, 1 kilo, well, like 1.25 kilos to 1.5 kilos, we get to 1.5, we're probably pretty good on pre-wean. But if we're down in the 1.2, 1.25 kilo range, that bump feeding might have a significantly greater dollar return for you than somebody who's sitting closer to the 1.5 kilo mark.
Right. And just maybe point out for the Canadian audience, especially the Western Canadian audience, the Eastern Canadian audience, at least Ontario and a good chunk of Quebec would be feeding corn-based diets. But in Western Canada, the energy levels of the diets are going to be substantially lower because they're feeding wheat, barley, canola. So your kilo might translate into 1.1, 1.2 kilos under those circumstances. But as you said, it's not really a precise number of what that bump needs to be. And again, I guess I go back to your earlier comment, Laura, what's best for your farm, and be observational and make decisions on that basis. But I appreciate that. So fundamentally, you're not a bump feeding kind of person, except when it comes to feeding gilts, and then you are. Is that a fair description of your position?
Yes, that would be a fair description.
Okay, very, very good. Any other comments about feeding in gestation, Laura?
Yeah, I think, again, when we go back into nutritional programs, we recognize that we're not feeding fat in these diets. We're not focused on high energy. We're really focused on controlling sow weight so that she's not growing too large, so that we're not going to end up paying more for maintenance than we are for production. So we always want to be mindful of that. certainly we have seen some things, and I think I'm going to put the weaning female in here and not in lactation. But if we think about a sow that's newly weaned, who's generally out in the gestation barn, making sure she has access to food is going to be absolutely critical. So I've seen situations where we wean a sow in lactation and we close down the automatic feeders the night before. And right, she cleans up that feed tube, which is what we want, so we can clean the barn the next day. We bring her out into the gestation barn, but we generally aren't going to bring her out till after the morning food drop has occurred in gestation. And if that's the only food drop that occurs that day, she may not receive feed. If it's half of a day, then she gets half of an allowance. And we know through research that if we miss that first day, we lengthen weaned estrus and we can lengthen total born. And so, if you know that's happening in your barns, you might have to invest in a feed cart and a scoop and, deliver feed to those animals once they're out in the gestation barn that day of weaning. So, gestation management really starts at the time of weaning. It doesn't start at the time of breeding. Right. And so that would be the other piece that I think is really important for our producers to be thinking about. Nutritionally, we talk about lysine and the requirements of a gestating sow. And we do know that as she lengthens her time in gestation, her own lysine requirements will increase. And so, this has always been the argument around bump feeding and the value. And so I think that's where Chantel's data is really starting to say, well, it may not be in the birth weight, but that lysine requirement might be going into other things like mammary development, et cetera, right before birth. And so, just be mindful of those things from a nutritional perspective, right? The NRC does a pretty good job of defining what pigs need at this point in gestation, but really think about, we've got to start managing her body condition, feeding program from the time she's weaned until the time she goes in.
So Laura, last question. I know I'm putting you on the spot a little bit because I'm not sure there's any data in here, but if you have experience or a sense for that newly weaned sow, she's moved into gestation, and there's that 5 to 7 day period before she's going to be bred. How much are we feeding her today? Are we ad lib feeding her? Are we feeding her to a certain amount? Are we feeding her according to body condition? What should be our standard for feeding those animals? And then I guess along with that, once she's bred, do you have a specific recommendation there? We used to talk about worrying about overfeeding in that period of implantation, and I don't know if that still applies or not. But first off, for the newly weaned sow until the time of breeding, what should we be feeding her? Or how much should we be feeding her?
How much should we be feeding her? Yes. So we would used to say that it should be ad libitum feed. And I think it's still a safe statement to make, but I will parenthesis that. So we did some research where we looked at feeding 2.5 kilos versus 3 kilos versus about 5.5 kilos. And what we found was as long as we were above 3 kilos, we didn't really see any additional advantage. Again, in an animal that leaves lactation in good condition and is not a gilt, we didn't see an impact.
No. Okay.
Anything Good. Other than a very nice looking female coming out of lactation needed that extra, needed to go to 5 kilos or higher, right? So she's going to come down on her feed intake pretty quickly within, 48 to 72 hours. She's going to be uncomfortable because of the milk overflow. Plus, as she comes into heat, she is going to come off of feed. But that first 24 to 48 hours, we really want to say a minimum of 3 kilos, 3.5 kilos is kind of my cutoff as a minimum. But again, that's why we say ad libitum, because if we've got people in the barn who don't have the time to really go through and individually hand feed and think about body condition, it's just easier. So that's where we're at there. And then what was your second question?
Yeah, the other was then after breeding, is there what's the current recommendation? I'm not up to date on that in terms of feeding from the time of breeding for, let's say, that 4-week period, 30-day period after breeding.
Yeah, I think the audience is still out. There's still a lot of argument over which is better. So me personally, I just like to bring them up a little bit over maintenance, but I'm not aggressively feeding them. So I like to see body condition where I want it by day 60. And so I'm giving a body condition score at day 0, at day 30, at day 60, and day 90. And so I like to bring them up on feed slowly if I'm trying to add weight. So I'm not too aggressive early on, because we do still worry about embryo survivability and some of those old conversations. And I do still think there are some genetics that do tend to respond a little bit differently in that time period, which is why I think the data is still a little bit conflicting. I would say don't be too aggressive, but if you have thin sows, give them a little extra. And then, work with your nutritionist on what maintenance is, right? So as you mentioned, energy diets or energy density is going to be different across different areas. So let that nutritionist work to figure out, is that 2 kilos? Is that 2.5? What is it for you that's going to be the maintenance level to hold a normal sow at normal condition?
Gotcha. Great.
Mm-hmm.
And just to summarize then, from weaning until breeding, ad lib is not a wrong thing to do, but certainly a minimum of 3 kilograms per animal in that period would be your minimum, and recognizing that some animals may want 4 or even 5 kilograms during that period. And also that there's lots of things going on in that sow. She's drying up. She's coming into heat. There's lots of things that are going to be challenging her feed intake, no matter what we put in front of them. And then after breeding, you would like to, in a gradual way, you don't want to overdo it, but you feel you've got 60 days to get that animal up to the body condition that you would like her to be. And you're going to be measuring body condition at weaning, or breeding, whichever, and then 30 days and 60 days later, and maybe a follow-up at 90 just to confirm.
Yes, correct.
Very good.
It's time for our famous 3.
That's a good mouthful for one podcast, Laura. Thank you very much. We'll finish then with appreciate all those comments on feeding the gestating sow. But let's wrap it up with some our 3 common questions. And the first question, of course, is, do you have a book on swine nutrition or swine generally that you would recommend to our audience that you think is worth having on your shelf or reading cover to cover?
Yes, I think I would be remiss as a nutritionist if I did not say the NRC, right? That is truly the golden book of any nutritionist. It may not fit all of our listeners on here, but I still do think that even for a producer, there's some very good pieces to that that kind of help give you either some background, or if you're concerned of a deficiency or a toxicity, there's some very nice descriptions in there to help you through that process of trying to better understand what might be going on in your barn.
Excellent. And it wouldn't be inappropriate for me to point out that you're on the new NRC committee, Laura.
Yes, so needless to say, I'm reading it quite heavily these days.
There you go. Yeah. It's your favorite book, whether it's your favorite book or not right now. And then what about just a general reading book, a fiction read for pleasure, or a nonfiction book read perhaps could also be for pleasure or for personal, professional development?
So a book I recently read was called Man's Search for Meaning, and that's by Viktor Frankl. And it was recommended in another conversation. Actually, it was at a pork producer meeting, and it was recommended. And it's a very nice book. This gentleman is a psychologist by training and was captured by the Nazi army and was in concentration camps. And so he has some time where he shares his experiences, but it's not really meant to be all about his experiences, but rather about how people handle and manage stress and the things that we do. And so it has some real life applications to, maybe how we ourselves manage and think about stress and handle ourselves in times of difficult situations. And so it's a very, very interesting read for me in that aspect. So that is one I would recommend.
Great. Yeah, sounds interesting. And then the last question is, you look in the industry and you see some of the people who have risen to the kind of the top of the game, so to speak. And what is it about people that stand out in the crowd in the world of swine nutrition or swine production that you think has allowed them to achieve that level of success? What is it about them? And therefore, what is something or some things that our audience that is in the early stages of their career might want to pay attention to in order to help them achieve their own success in their career?
Yeah, a couple of pieces to that. One of the ones that comes to mind right now is networking. And right, individuals who are successful have a really good ability to network. And it's not how many people you have following you on Instagram, right? That's not the kind of network I'm referring to. These are truly people that you feel comfortable reaching out to. They could be fellow colleagues. They could be people who had years of experience. It doesn't really matter, but these are people that you have no problem calling and saying, here's an idea I've been thinking about. I had friends in this industry that if I'm formulating a mineral mix, and minerals are not my forte, and I will call them up and say, double check my math for me, please. Right. So sometimes it can be as simple as that, or nope, I've got a greater problem. I have a PRRS break in my barn, or I have something going on and I need to know how somebody else has done it. And so that is something that I do see is very valuable, is people that are willing to sit and ask questions, but also on the opposite side, willing to share with others and, help the next group up. I think networking offers a lot of great opportunities.
Right. Excellent suggestion. Well, once again, Laura, thank you so very much. You have so much experience in the area of sow feeding and management. We appreciate you taking time to share that expertise with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Have a great day.